He lost his wife years ago, but when his daughter hugged her teacher, the billionaire loved again. Hey there, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from before we start. And once the story ends, make sure to give it a score from 0 to 10. Enjoy the ride. Some mornings, Ethan Mercer woke up and forgot she was gone. For exactly 3 seconds, his hand would reach across the California king bed, searching for the warmth that had once been there. The silk sheets were always cold now, perfectly pressed by his housekeeper, untouched by dreams or whispered conversations that used to stretch past midnight. Then reality would crash back. The empty space, the silence, the weight of being responsible for keeping 2 hearts beating when his own felt like it had stopped 3 years ago. "Daddy?" Sophie's small voice drifted through the monitor on his nightstand. Even at 6 years old, she spoke in whispers, as if the world might shatter if she raised her voice too loud. Ethan rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold marble floor of his penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was already alive with morning traffic, people rushing to jobs that mattered, lives that felt whole. He envied them. Sophie's bedroom was a monument to every parenting book he'd ever read. Soft lavender walls, organic cotton bedding, educational toys arranged in perfect order. Everything designed to create the childhood his daughter deserved. Everything except what she needed most: a mother's touch. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, still in her pajamas, staring at her hands. Her dark hair fell in waves around her face, so much like her mother's that sometimes it took his breath away. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Ready for another day at the new school?" Sophie's shoulders tensed. Yesterday had been her first day at Riverside Elementary, and she'd come home even quieter than usual. No tears, no complaints, just silence, which somehow felt worse. "I don't want to go," she whispered. Ethan's chest tightened. He'd tried everything: the best private schools, specialized tutors, child psychologists who cost more per hour than most people made in a month. Nothing worked. Sophie had built walls around herself that seemed impossible to break down. "Tell me what's wrong and I'll fix it," he said, the same promise he'd made every morning for 3 years. Sophie looked up at him with eyes that held too much sadness for a 6-year-old. "You can't fix everything, Daddy." The words hit him like a physical blow, because she was right. He couldn't fix the car accident that had taken her mother. He couldn't fix the nightmares that woke her up screaming. He couldn't fix the way she flinched when other adults tried to hug her. And he couldn't fix the way his own heart had turned to stone, leaving him capable of building tech empires, but incapable of the one thing his daughter needed most: showing her that love was still possible. "What if I told you there's a teacher there who helps kids feel better?" he said, remembering what the principal had mentioned yesterday. "Her name is Miss Grace, and she's really good at understanding kids who feel different." Sophie tilted her head, considering. "Different how?" "Kids who miss someone very much," Ethan said carefully. "Kids who feel scared sometimes, even when they're safe." For the first time in weeks, Sophie made eye contact with him. "Does she know about missing mommies?" Ethan's throat closed up. He nodded, not trusting his voice. 30 minutes later, he was walking Sophie through the bright hallways of Riverside Elementary, her small hand gripping his with desperate strength. The school was nothing like the private academies he'd toured. No marble floors or brass fixtures, just colorful artwork on the walls, the sound of children's laughter, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman's voice made him turn around, and then his world tilted. She was standing in the doorway of what must be her classroom, auburn hair catching the morning light, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, warm hazel eyes that seemed to see right through him. "I'm Grace Whitmore," she said, walking toward them with a smile that reached her eyes. "You must be Sophie." Sophie pressed closer to Ethan's leg, but she didn't hide behind him completely, which was more progress than she'd made with any other adult in months. "I heard you might need a friend today," Grace said, crouching down to Sophie's level. "I could use one too. Would you like to help me feed the class goldfish? His name is Bubbles, and he's very picky about his breakfast." Sophie looked up at Ethan, then back at Grace. "What does he like to eat?" "That's the mystery," Grace said conspiratorially. "We'll have to figure it out together." As Grace led them into the classroom, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years, something that felt dangerous and impossible and absolutely terrifying, because for the first time since the accident, He was looking at a woman and feeling something other than emptiness, and that felt like the biggest betrayal of all. But what Ethan didn't know was that some betrayals are actually beginnings in disguise. The text message arrived at 2:47 p.m. just as Ethan was reviewing quarterly projections in his glass-walled office on the 40th floor. "Mr. Mercer, could you come to school? Sophie is fine, but there's been an incident." Grace Whitmore. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed his keys, leaving his assistant scrambling to reschedule the rest of his afternoon. The 20-minute drive to Riverside Elementary felt like an eternity, every worst-case scenario playing in his mind. He found Grace waiting for him in the main hallway, her expression carefully neutral, the kind of face teachers learn to wear when delivering bad news gently. "What happened?" he asked, scanning her face for clues. "She's okay," Grace said immediately. But during art time, one of the other children accidentally knocked over Sophie's project. It was just a cardboard house, nothing major, but she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sophie had a panic attack." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Where is she now?" "In my classroom. She's been sitting under my desk for the past hour. She won't come out and she won't talk to anyone else." They walked toward the classroom in silence, Ethan's mind racing. 3 years of therapy, thousands of dollars in treatments, and his daughter was still falling apart over a cardboard house. What kind of father was he? "Mr. Mercer," Grace said softly, stopping him just outside her classroom door. "Before you go in, I need you to know something. When the panic attack started, she didn't call for you." Ethan's chest tightened. Who did she call for? Grace met his eyes, and he saw something there. Surprise, maybe even wonder. Her mother. She kept saying, "I want my mommy, I want my mommy," over and over until she couldn't breathe. The words hit him like a physical blow. Sophie never talked about her mother, not once in 3 years. Her therapist had said it was part of her coping mechanism, complete avoidance of the trauma. "But here's what I think is important," Grace continued. "She's starting to process the loss. The feelings she's been holding inside are finally coming out. That's actually progress." Ethan stared at her. "You call my daughter having a breakdown progress?" "I call your daughter finally feeling safe enough to grieve progress," Grace said firmly. "She's been carrying this pain alone for 3 years. Today she let it out. That takes enormous courage." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. There was a depth in her eyes, an understanding that went beyond professional training. "You sound like you know something about that," he said quietly. Grace's expression flickered for just a moment. "I do." Before he could ask what she meant, a small voice called from inside the classroom. "Miss Grace, is my daddy here?" "Yes, sweetheart," Grace called back. "Do you want to see him? Will you stay too?" Grace looked at Ethan, asking permission with her eyes. He nodded. They found Sophie exactly where Grace had said, curled up under the teacher's desk, her school dress wrinkled, her face streaked with dried tears. But she wasn't hiding anymore. She was sitting up, watching them with those dark eyes that looked so much like her mother's. "Hey, baby," Ethan said, crouching down beside the desk. "I heard you had a scary day." Sophie nodded, then looked at Grace. "Miss Grace says it's okay to be sad about Mommy." Ethan's throat constricted. He glanced at Grace, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, somehow making herself seem smaller, less threatening. "Miss Grace is right," he managed. "It's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss her." "Are you sad about Mommy too?" Sophie asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 3 years, Ethan had been the strong one, the one who held everything together. He'd never let Sophie see him break down, never let her know that some nights he sat in his car in the garage and cried until he couldn't breathe. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm sad about Mommy too." Sophie crawled out from under the desk and wrapped her arms around his neck. Not the careful, distant hug she usually gave, but a real embrace, desperate and fierce. "I miss her so much, Daddy," she sobbed against his shoulder. "I miss her so much it hurts." "I know, baby. I know." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while 3 years of buried grief finally found its way to the surface. And through it all, Grace sat quietly nearby, not intruding, not trying to fix anything, just witnessing their pain with a compassion that felt almost sacred. When Sophie finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer than they'd been in months. "Miss Grace," she said, turning to her teacher, "thank you for letting me be sad." Grace smiled, and Ethan saw tears in her eyes. "You're very welcome, sweetheart. Being sad about people we love is one of the ways we honor them." As they prepared to leave, Sophie did something unexpected. She walked over to Grace and hugged her, briefly, but genuinely. "See you tomorrow, Miss Grace," she said. It was the first time in 3 years that Sophie had voluntarily hugged another adult. Later, as Ethan drove home with Sophie sleeping in the back seat, he found himself thinking about Grace Whitmore, the way she'd handled the crisis with such calm wisdom, the way she'd known exactly what to say, what not to say, the way she'd looked at him when Sophie was crying, as if she understood exactly what he was going through, and the way his heart had stuttered when she'd smiled at his daughter. That night after Sophie was asleep, Ethan sat in his home office staring at his laptop screen. He'd started to write Grace an email 3 times, wanting to thank her for today, but every time he began typing, the words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for giving your child permission to feel again? How do you thank someone for making you realize that maybe, just maybe, healing doesn't mean forgetting? But what Ethan didn't know was that Grace Whitmore had her own reasons for understanding grief, and her own walls that were about to come crashing down. The email arrived at 11:23 p.m., long after any reasonable person should be checking their work messages. "Miss Grace, thank you for today. I don't have the words to express what you did for Sophie, and for me. If you have time this week, I'd love to buy you coffee and discuss how I can support her progress at home. Ethan Mercer." Grace stared at the message on her laptop screen, curled up on her small apartment couch with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. Outside her window, rain tapped against the glass and the sound of late-night traffic hummed through the thin walls. She'd been teaching for 8 years, had worked with hundreds of children, dozens of parents, but something about today had shaken her. The way Ethan had looked when Sophie finally broke down, the way his voice had cracked when he admitted he was sad too, the way he'd held his daughter like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. It reminded her too much of herself at 15, standing in a hospital hallway, learning that some people you love just don't come home. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something professionally appropriate. "I'd be happy to meet. There's a cafe called Corner Grounds on 5th Street, tomorrow at 4 p.m. His response came back within minutes. "I'll be there." The next afternoon, Grace arrived at Corner Grounds 5 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. The cafe was the kind of place that felt lived in. Mismatched furniture, local artwork on the walls, the smell of fresh-baked muffins mixing with espresso. She spotted Ethan the moment he walked in. Even in casual clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being the smartest person in the room. But there was something different about him today. The sharp edges seemed softer somehow. "Thank you for making time for this," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I know you didn't have to. Sophie is my student," Grace said simply. "Her well-being is my responsibility." "Is it?" Ethan asked, studying her face. "Because what you did yesterday felt like more than professional responsibility. It felt like you actually cared." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Of course I care. All teachers care about their students." "No," Ethan said quietly. "Not like that. You knew exactly what to say to her. You understood something that 3 years of therapists couldn't figure out." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You said you know about carrying grief. What did you mean?" Grace's hand tightened around her coffee cup. This was why she usually kept her distance from parents, why she maintained professional boundaries. Because eventually, they wanted to know why she was so good at helping broken children. "I lost my parents when I was 15, she said finally. "Car accident. Ice storm. They were coming to pick me up from a friend's house." She took a shaky breath. "I spent 3 years after that living with my aunt, pretending I was fine, never talking about them, never crying. Everyone said I was handling it so well." Ethan's expression softened. "But you weren't handling it at all." "I was drowning," Grace admitted. "I was drowning in silence, and everyone thought I was swimming." She met his eyes. "That's what Sophie's been doing. Drowning in silence while everyone worried about her not talking to people or making friends. But the real problem was bigger than that. She wasn't allowed to grieve," Ethan said, understanding dawning on his face. "Were you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "I had to be strong for her," he said finally. "I had to hold everything together. I couldn't fall apart because she needed me to be okay." "And what about what you needed?" "What I needed didn't matter." Grace leaned forward slightly. "What if I told you that Sophie needs to see you grieve? That she needs to know it's okay to not be okay? I can't do that to her, she's just a child." She's a child who thinks her feelings are wrong because she's never seen an adult express them. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. When I was 15, my aunt never cried in front of me. She never talked about my parents. She thought she was protecting me. But what she was really doing was teaching me that grief was something to be ashamed of. Ethan stared at her, and Grace could see the war playing out on his face. The fear of being vulnerable warring with the growing realization that she might be right. How did you get through it? He asked. I had a teacher, Grace said with a small smile. Mrs. Henderson. She taught 8th grade English and she'd lost her husband the year before. One day she was reading us a poem about loss, and she just started crying, right there in front of the whole class. And afterwards she said, "Some things are too beautiful and too sad to experience without tears." What happened then? I went to her after class and cried for the first time in 3 years. She held me while I sobbed, and she told me that loving someone who's gone doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Sophie asked me last night if I dream about her mother. Do you? Every night. But I told her I dream about happy things instead. He looked up at Grace. That was a lie. What do you really dream about? I dream about the accident. I dream about the phone call. I dream about having to tell a 3-year-old that her mommy isn't coming home. His voice broke slightly. And sometimes I dream about her. And when I wake up, I forget she's gone, and I have to lose her all over again. Grace reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The touch was brief, professional, but something electric passed between them. Sophie needs to know that, she said softly. She needs to know that missing her mother is normal, that it's okay to have sad dreams and happy dreams about the same person. How do I do that without scaring her? You start small. You tell her one true thing about how you feel, and then you tell her it's okay for her to feel it too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Finally, Ethan spoke again. I should probably mention that I Googled you last night. Grace's eyebrows rose. Oh? Master's degree in childhood trauma therapy. Published research on grief processing in elementary-aged children. 3 years working with foster kids before you came to Riverside. He paused. You're not just a teacher, are you? I'm a teacher who chose to specialize in helping kids like Sophie, Grace said carefully. Kids like I used to be. And that's why you're so good at it. That's why I care so much about getting it right. Ethan studied her face, and Grace felt exposed under his gaze, like he could see all the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart. Can I ask you something else? He said. Sure. Yesterday, when Sophie hugged you, that was the first time she'd done that with anyone other than me in 3 years. What did that feel like? Grace's breath caught, because the truth was, it had felt like coming home. It had felt like all the broken pieces of her 15-year-old self were finally being put back together. But she couldn't say that. Not to him. It felt like privilege, she said instead. It felt like trust. But as they said goodbye in the parking lot, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Something that had nothing to do with Sophie's education, and everything to do with the way Ethan had looked at her when she'd taken his hand. Something that felt dangerous and wonderful and absolutely terrifying. Because sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving too. The phone call came at 6:43 a.m. on a Thursday, jolting Ethan from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Mr. Mercer? This is Principal Williams from Riverside Elementary. I'm calling because Sophie isn't in her classroom and Miss Whitmore is quite concerned. Ethan shot upright in bed, his heart hammering. What do you mean she's not in her classroom? I dropped her off myself 20 minutes ago. She went to the bathroom after morning announcements and, well, she hasn't come back. We've checked everywhere. Miss Whitmore thinks she might be hiding. Ethan was already pulling on clothes, his mind racing through possibilities. I'll be right there. He found Grace in the school's main hallway, talking quietly with the principal and a security guard. The moment she saw him, relief flooded her face. Any word? He asked. I think I know where she is, Grace said, leading him toward the back of the school. There's a supply closet near the art room. Yesterday she mentioned it was quiet there, like a safe cave. They found Sophie exactly where Grace had predicted, curled up behind a stack of construction paper, her school backpack clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Hey, sweetheart, Grace said softly, crouching down. Can you tell us what's wrong? Sophie looked up at her father, her bottom lip trembling. Today is the day Mommy died. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd been dreading this day for weeks, but somehow he'd thought Sophie wouldn't remember, wouldn't understand the significance of the date. I know, baby, he said, settling down beside her in the cramped space. I know what day it is. I don't want to be at school, Sophie whispered. I want to go see her. Ethan felt his chest tighten. They'd only been to the cemetery once, right after the funeral, and Sophie had been too young to really understand. He'd avoided going back, telling himself it would be too hard for her. We can do that, he said, the words surprising even himself. We can go see Mommy. Really? Really. But first, can you tell Miss Grace and me why you were hiding? Sophie wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Tiana asked me why I was sad, and I told her my mommy died 3 years ago today. And she said that was a really long time ago and I should be over it by now. Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What did you say to Tiana? I said maybe some people never get over missing their mommies. And then she said I was being a baby, and everyone started looking at me and I had to hide. Oh, sweetheart, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. You were absolutely right. Some people never get over missing the people they love. And that doesn't make them babies, it makes them humans with very big hearts. Ethan watched Grace with growing wonder. Even in this cramped supply closet, she somehow knew exactly what to say, exactly how to make his daughter feel seen and understood. Miss Grace is right, he said. And you know what? I'm not over missing Mommy either. I don't think I ever will be. Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. You're not? No. And I'm starting to think that's okay. Missing someone means we loved them very much. An hour later, they were driving through the gates of Greenwood Cemetery, Sophie in the back seat clutching a small bouquet of yellow roses they'd stopped to buy. Grace had offered to stay behind, but Sophie had asked her to come. Mommy liked yellow flowers, Sophie said as they walked across the grass toward a simple granite headstone. Daddy used to bring her yellow roses every Friday. Ethan's throat constricted. He hadn't brought flowers to the grave in over a year. Somehow it had felt too painful, too final. Can I tell her about Miss Grace? Sophie asked as they approached the headstone. Of course. Sophie knelt down and carefully placed the roses at the base of the stone. Hi, Mommy. I brought Daddy and my teacher to meet you. Her name is Miss Grace, and she's really nice. She helps me when I'm sad about missing you. Ethan found himself kneeling beside his daughter, reading his wife's name engraved in stone. Isabella Claire Mercer, beloved wife and mother. Miss Grace says it's okay to miss you forever, Sophie continued, her small voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. And Daddy says he misses you too, so I don't have to pretend I don't anymore. Grace stood a respectful distance away, giving them privacy, but Ethan could feel her presence like a warm anchor in the midst of his grief. Daddy, Sophie said, will you tell Mommy about your dreams? Ethan's breath caught. This was what Grace had meant about starting small, about sharing one true thing. Sometimes I dream about the day you were born, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mommy was so excited she couldn't stop crying happy tears. And sometimes I dream about our wedding day when she laughed so hard during our vows that she snorted, and everyone in the church started laughing too. Sophie giggled softly. Mommy snorted? Like a little pig. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. What else do you dream about? Ethan closed his eyes, feeling 3 years of buried emotions rising to the surface. Sometimes I dream about the accident, about the phone call, about how sorry I am that I couldn't protect her. It wasn't your fault, Daddy. The words came from Sophie, but they hit him like a revelation. For 3 years, he'd been carrying the weight of guilt, as if loving someone meant being able to save them from everything. No, he said, the realization settling over him like grace. It wasn't my fault. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn sun filtering through the trees above them. Finally, Sophie spoke again. Daddy, I think Mommy would like Miss Grace. Ethan looked over at Grace, who was sitting on a nearby bench, giving them space but staying close enough to offer support if needed. The morning light caught the auburn in her hair, and when she smiled at Sophie, Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Why do you think that, sweetheart? Because Miss Grace takes care of you too. When you get that worried look, she makes it go away. Mommy always did that. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to really see what had been happening over the past few weeks. Grace hadn't just been helping Sophie heal. She'd been helping him too. As they walked back to the car, Sophie skipping ahead to collect fallen leaves, Grace fell into step beside him. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming today, for knowing she needed this. Thank you for letting me be here, Grace replied, for trusting me with something so personal. Sophie was right, you know, about you taking care of me too. Grace looked up at him, and for a moment he saw vulnerability in her eyes that matched his own. "Maybe we're taking care of each other," she said softly. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan found himself standing in his home office staring at a framed photo of his wife. For the first time in 3 years, looking at her picture didn't feel like drowning. It felt like remembering someone he'd loved completely and would always love. But it also felt like permission to love again. Because sometimes healing begins when we stop trying to forget and start learning to carry our love forward. The parent-teacher conference was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, long after the other children had gone home and the hallways of Riverside Elementary had fallen quiet. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, carrying 2 cups of coffee from Corner Grounds, and feeling nervous in a way that had nothing to do with Sophie's academic progress. Over the past 2 weeks since their visit to the cemetery, something had shifted between him and Grace. Their conversations had grown longer, more personal. Their text messages about Sophie's homework had started including questions about each other's days. He was walking into dangerous territory and he knew it. Grace looked up when he knocked on her classroom door, and the smile that spread across her face made his pulse quicken. "You brought coffee," she said, accepting the cup gratefully. "You're officially my favorite parent. Just tonight or permanently?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, more flirtatious than he'd intended. Grace's cheeks flushed slightly. "That depends on how this conference goes." They settled at the small table she used for parent meetings. Sophie's artwork and recent assignments spread between them. But Ethan found himself more interested in watching Grace's hands as she gestured while talking. The way her eyes lit up when she described Sophie's progress. "She's been a completely different child since our cemetery visit," Grace was saying. "More engaged in class, willing to participate in group activities. Yesterday she even comforted another student who was crying about a skinned knee. She's been different at home too," Ethan said. "She talks about her mother now. Little things, stories about before she died, questions about what she was like. It's like," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's like she's not afraid of her memories anymore." "That's exactly what healing looks like," Grace said softly. "Learning that remembering someone doesn't have to hurt. That love doesn't end just because someone is gone." There was something in her voice, a personal weight to the words that made him look at her more carefully. "You speak from experience," he said. "Don't we all have someone we've had to learn to love from a distance?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Ethan found himself wondering about Grace's own losses, her own journey through grief. But before he could ask, his phone buzzed with a text message. "It's my housekeeper," he said, reading the screen. "Sophie woke up from a nightmare. She's asking for—" He looked up at Grace, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "She's asking for you." Grace didn't hesitate. "Let's go." 20 minutes later, they were standing in Sophie's bedroom doorway, watching her sleep fitfully in her princess bed. The nightlight cast soft shadows across her tear-stained face. "She does this sometimes," Ethan whispered. "Calls out for people when she's dreaming. Usually it's me or—" He swallowed hard. "Or her mother. But tonight it was me," Grace said quietly. "Tonight it was you." Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Grace standing beside her father, relief flooded her small face. "Miss Grace," she whispered. "You came." "Of course I came," Grace said, settling on the edge of the bed. "What was the scary dream about?" "I dreamed that everyone I love goes away," Sophie said, her voice small and fragile. "First Mommy, then Daddy, then you." Ethan's chest tightened. He started to move toward the bed, but Grace's gentle gesture stopped him. She was handling this with the same intuitive grace she brought to everything involving his daughter. "Sophie," Grace said, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Can I tell you a secret?" Sophie nodded. "The people we love never really go away. They live right here." Grace placed her hand over Sophie's heart. "In all the love they gave us. Your mommy is still with you every day, in every hug your daddy gives you, in every time you're brave, and every time you're kind to someone else." "What about you?" Sophie asked. "Will you go away too?" Grace glanced at Ethan, and in that moment, he saw the same fear in her eyes that Sophie was expressing. The fear of caring too much, of letting someone too close, of risking another loss. "I'm not going anywhere," Grace said, and something in her voice told Ethan she was making a promise that went beyond professional boundaries. After Sophie fell back asleep, Ethan walked Grace to her car in the driveway. The October air was crisp, their breath visible in small clouds as they talked. "I'm sorry she called you," he said. "I shouldn't have texted. It's not your responsibility to— Ethan, Grace interrupted, turning to face him. I wanted to come. When I got your text, I didn't think about professional boundaries or appropriate protocols. I just thought about a little girl who needed me. And that doesn't scare you? Grace was quiet for a long moment, her keys jangling softly in her hand. Terrifies me, she admitted. I've spent most of my adult life being very careful not to get too attached to my students' families. But Sophie— She paused. Sophie feels different. Different how? Like family, Grace said quietly. The words settled between them like a confession. Ethan stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of her perfume. Grace, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are we doing here? I don't know, she breathed. But I can't seem to stop. For a moment they stood there in the driveway, the space between them charged with possibility. Ethan raised his hand, almost touching her face before dropping it again. This is complicated, he said. I know. I haven't felt anything like this since— I know. My daughter adores you. I adore her too. And I'm falling for you so hard it scares me. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Grace's breath caught, and for a moment Ethan thought she might step back, might retreat behind professional walls. Instead, she stepped closer. I'm scared too, she whispered. I'm scared because I've never felt this safe with anyone before. I'm scared because when Sophie asked if I would go away, I realized I don't want to. Not ever. Grace. I'm scared because I'm falling for both of you, she continued, her voice trembling. For the man who brings me coffee and asks about my day, and for the little girl who trusts me with her nightmares. And I don't know what that makes me, professionally or personally, but I can't pretend it's not happening anymore. Ethan reached out then, his fingers gently touching her cheek. It makes you human, he said. It makes you someone who cares too much and loves too deeply, and it makes you exactly the kind of person Sophie and I need in our lives. What if we mess this up? What if we hurt her? What if we don't? What if we get this right? Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for just a moment. When she opened them again, there was resolve mixed with the fear. I need time to think, she said. About what this means, about how to handle the school situation, about whether it's worth the risk. Ethan finished. No, Grace said firmly. About how to make it work. Because you're right. This is worth the risk. Both of you are worth the risk. As she drove away, Ethan stood in his driveway watching her taillights disappear into the night. For the first time in 3 years, he was thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. And for the first time in his life, that future included someone who loved his daughter almost as much as he did, because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't falling in love, it's admitting you already have. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small bedroom, staring at the ceiling while replaying every moment from Ethan's driveway. The way he'd looked at her when she admitted she was falling for both of them, the gentle touch of his fingers against her cheek, the way her heart had hammered when he'd stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. By morning, she'd made a decision that felt both brave and terrifying. She arrived at school early, before the buses started arriving, and knocked on Principal Williams' office door. Grace? Mrs. Williams looked up from her computer with surprise. You're here early. Everything all right? I need to talk to you about something, Grace said, settling into the chair across from the principal's desk. About Sophie Mercer and potential conflicts of interest. Mrs. Williams's eyebrows rose. Go on. Grace had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head, but actually saying the words felt harder than she'd expected. Her father and I have developed feelings for each other. Nothing inappropriate has happened, but I wanted to be transparent about the situation before it goes any further. The principal leaned back in her chair, studying Grace's face. I see. And how long has this been developing? Slowly, over the past month, since Sophie's breakthrough with her grief processing. Grace twisted her hands in her lap. I know it puts me in a difficult position professionally, and I'm prepared to transfer Sophie to another classroom if necessary. Is that what you want to do? The question caught Grace off guard. What do you mean? I mean, is transferring Sophie what's best for her? Or are you just trying to protect yourself from a complicated situation? Grace was quiet for a moment, considering. Sophie has made incredible progress. Moving her to another teacher right now could undo months of emotional work. And Mr. Mercer? What does he think about all this? We haven't had a chance to discuss the practical implications yet. Last night was the first time we really acknowledged what's happening between us. Mrs. Williams nodded thoughtfully. Grace, in 23 years of education, I've seen a lot of situations like this. Parents and teachers connecting over a shared investment in a child's well-being. Most of the time, people try to pretend it's not happening, which creates more problems than it solves. So what do you suggest? Honesty, documentation, and very clear boundaries about when you're Sophie's teacher and when you're whatever you are to her father. Mrs. Williams pulled out a yellow legal pad. If you want to pursue this relationship, we'll need to establish some protocols. No personal discussions during school hours. No special treatment for Sophie. All communications about her education go through official channels. Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her. You're not asking me to choose between my job and this? I'm asking you to be professional about managing both. Can you do that? Yes, Grace said without hesitation. Absolutely. Good. Now there's something else we need to discuss. Mrs. Williams's expression grew more serious. I had a call yesterday from Candace Morrison. Grace's stomach dropped. Candace Morrison was Tiana's mother, the girl who'd told Sophie she should be over her mother's death by now. What kind of call? Apparently Tiana came home upset because Sophie had talked about visiting her mother's grave. Mrs. Morrison feels that Sophie is bringing unhealthy death talk into the classroom and wants her moved to a different section. Grace felt anger surge through her chest. Sophie is processing grief in exactly the way she should be. She's finally healthy enough to talk about her mother without falling apart. I agree completely. But Mrs. Morrison is threatening to escalate to the school board if we don't address her concerns. Mrs. Williams sighed. Politics aside, how do you think Sophie would handle being moved to Mr. Kumar's class? It would devastate her, Grace said immediately. She's just started to trust again, to feel safe opening up. Moving her now would feel like punishment for finally healing. That's what I told Mrs. Morrison. But she's persistent, and she has connections on the school board. Grace sat in stunned silence for a moment. After everything Sophie had been through, after all the progress they'd made, some entitled parent wanted to derail it all because she was uncomfortable with the reality of grief. What can we do? For now, nothing. I've scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Morrison for next week to discuss the situation. In the meantime, continue working with Sophie exactly as you have been. Document everything. And Grace? Mrs. Williams fixed her with a steady look. Be prepared for this to get complicated. When people start asking questions about Sophie's education, they're going to start asking questions about your relationship with her father, too. An hour later, Grace was standing outside her classroom when Ethan arrived with Sophie. She could see the question in his eyes immediately. He was wondering if the conversation they'd had last night had changed anything. Good morning, Sophie, Grace said, crouching down to the little girl's level. I love your backpack today. Is that new? Daddy bought it for me because I told him purple was my favorite color, Sophie said, beaming. He said maybe Mommy liked purple too because I got it from her. Grace glanced up at Ethan, seeing the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was what healthy grief looked like, integrating memories of his wife into their daily life instead of avoiding them. I bet she did, Grace said. Purple is a very beautiful color. Miss Grace? Sophie looked suddenly serious. Are you okay? You look worried. Out of the mouths of babes. Grace forced a smile. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about all the fun things we're going to learn today. As Sophie ran into the classroom to hang up her backpack, Ethan stepped closer to Grace. We need to talk, he said quietly. About last night. About what comes next. I know. I spoke with Principal Williams this morning about the situation. And she's supportive as long as we maintain professional boundaries during school hours. Grace lowered her voice. But there's something else. Another parent is trying to get Sophie transferred out of my class. Ethan's expression darkened. What? Why? Grace quickly explained about Candace Morrison's complaint, watching Ethan's jaw tighten with each detail. Let me get this straight, he said when she finished. This woman wants my daughter punished for finally being healthy enough to talk about her mother? Ethan, you need to stay calm about this. Getting angry won't help Sophie. Getting angry might be exactly what helps Sophie, Ethan said, his voice low and controlled. I didn't build a company from nothing by letting bullies push my family around. This isn't the corporate world. This is elementary school politics, and they're different. More personal, more vicious. Ethan studied her face, and Grace could see him processing not just the immediate problem, but the larger implications. This is about us, isn't it? He said finally. Someone's going to use our relationship against Sophie. Maybe. Probably. Grace met his eyes. The question is, are we strong enough to weather it? Are we committed enough to each other and to Sophie to fight for this? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching through the classroom window as Sophie helped another child organize crayons. Finally, he turned back to Grace. "I've spent 3 years trying to protect Sophie from anything that might hurt her," he said. "But I'm starting to realize that sometimes the things worth protecting are worth fighting for too. Even if it gets messy? Especially if it gets messy." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Grace, what we have, what we're building, it's not just about us anymore. Sophie needs this. She needs you. And He paused, vulnerability flickering across his face. "I need you too. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Whatever happens with the school, with other parents, with Sophie, we'll be in it together." Ethan reached out and briefly touched her hand, the contact lasting just long enough to send electricity up her arm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. As the morning bell rang and students began filing into the classroom, Grace felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because some things were worth fighting for. And the chance to build a family with Ethan and Sophie was definitely one of them. But neither of them realized that their biggest test was about to walk through the school's front doors. The woman standing in the school's main office was strikingly beautiful, with blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than Grace's monthly salary. But it was her eyes that made Grace's blood run cold. They were the exact same shade of green as Sophie's. "I'm looking for my granddaughter," the woman was saying to the receptionist, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Sophie Mercer. I'm Vivian Ashford." Grace froze in the hallway, her arms full of art supplies as the pieces clicked into place. Ashford, Isabella's maiden name. This was Sophie's maternal grandmother, the woman Ethan had mentioned exactly once and only to say that she'd cut contact after the funeral. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify your identity and check our authorized pickup list," the receptionist was saying diplomatically. "Young lady, I don't think you understand. I am Sophie's grandmother. I've driven 6 hours from Portland to see her, and I'm not leaving until I do." Grace's phone was already in her hand, texting Ethan. "Emergency. Sophie's grandmother is here. Office. Now." His response came back immediately. "On my way. Don't let her near Sophie." But even as Grace was reading the message, she heard Sophie's voice from behind her. "Miss Grace? Why is that lady asking about me?" Grace turned to find Sophie standing in the hallway with 2 other students, her small face curious, but not yet alarmed. She hadn't recognized her grandmother, which wasn't surprising considering she'd been only 3 at the funeral. "Sophie, honey, I need you to go back to the classroom with Jaden and Miranda, okay? I'll be right there. But please, sweetheart, trust me." Something in Grace's tone must have conveyed the urgency, because Sophie nodded and headed back toward the classroom, but not before Vivian Ashford caught sight of her through the office's glass partition. "Sophie," Vivian called out, her voice carrying across the lobby. "Sophie, it's Grandma Vivian." Sophie stopped, confusion written across her face. Grace moved quickly, positioning herself between the office and the hallway. "Mrs. Ashford," Grace said, stepping into the office. "I'm Grace Whitmore, Sophie's teacher. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Vivian's gaze sharpened as she took in Grace's appearance. "You're the teacher. I've heard about you." "I'm sorry?" "From the private investigator I hired to check on my granddaughter's welfare." Vivian's smile was cold and calculating. "Imagine my surprise to learn that Sophie's teacher has been spending quite a bit of time at my son-in-law's house. Late evening visits, personal text messages, very cozy." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Ashford, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" "Because from where I stand it looks like Ethan has been so busy playing house with his daughter's teacher that he's forgotten what's actually best for Sophie." "And what exactly do you think is best for Sophie?" "A stable home environment. A proper family structure, not some—" Vivian's eyes raked over Grace dismissively. "Some opportunistic young woman who sees dollar signs when she looks at a grieving widower." The accusation hit Grace like a slap, but before she could respond, Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "Vivian," his tone was ice cold as he strode into the office. "What the hell are you doing here? Checking on my granddaughter since you've apparently forgotten I exist?" "I didn't forget, I made a choice. The same choice Isabella would have made." Vivian's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment. "Don't you dare tell me what my daughter would have wanted. You have no idea what she'd think about you shacking up with some elementary school teacher, while her child is clearly crying out for help. Sophie is not crying out for help, Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sophie is healing. For the first time in 3 years, she's actually healing. Is she? Because the reports I've received suggest otherwise. Panic attacks at school, hiding in supply closets, talking obsessively about death and graveyards. Vivian's gaze flicked to Grace. All of this coinciding with your relationship with Miss Whitmore here. Grace felt sick. Every private moment, every breakthrough Sophie had made, had been twisted into evidence against them. Those weren't setbacks, Grace said, finding her voice. Those were breakthroughs. Sophie was finally processing her grief instead of burying it. How convenient that the solution to my granddaughter's problems happened to involve her teacher becoming romantically involved with her father. That's enough, Ethan said, stepping protectively closer to Grace. You don't get to walk back into our lives after 3 years and start making accusations. I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. And the fact is, I've already spoken with my attorney about filing for custody of Sophie. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Grace watched all the color drain from Ethan's face. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I have evidence of an unstable home environment, inappropriate relationships affecting Sophie's education, and a pattern of emotional disturbance that suggests neglect. Vivian straightened her coat with sharp, precise movements. My granddaughter deserves better than this chaos. Your granddaughter, Ethan said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, doesn't even remember you. You walked away from her when she needed family most, and now you want to swoop in and destroy the life we've built? I walked away because I was grieving my daughter's death, and you made it clear I wasn't welcome. You walked away because you blamed me for the accident. Because you should have been driving that night. Vivian's composure finally cracked, revealing the raw pain underneath. You should have picked her up from book club. You should have been the one on those icy roads, not my baby girl. The truth hung between them, ugly and devastating. Grace understood now why there had been no contact, why Ethan never talked about Isabella's family. The blame, the guilt, the mutual destruction that grief could cause when people turned on each other instead of supporting each other. You're right, Ethan said quietly. It should have been me. I've lived with that every day for 3 years. But destroying Sophie's life won't bring Isabella back. And neither will pretending you can replace her mother with some random teacher who's clearly taken advantage of a vulnerable situation. Miss Grace didn't take advantage of anything, a small voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Sophie standing in the office entrance, her face pale but determined. Behind her, Principal Williams looked mortified. Clearly Sophie had slipped past whoever was supposed to be watching her. Sophie, sweetheart, Grace started. No, Sophie said, walking into the room with more confidence than Grace had ever seen from her. I heard what the mean lady said about Miss Grace, and it's not true. Vivian knelt down, her expression softening as she looked at her granddaughter for the first time in 3 years. Sophie, honey, I'm your grandmother, your mommy's mommy. I came to see you because I love you very much. Sophie studied her grandmother's face with the serious intensity that only children possess. If you love me, why did you make Daddy sad? Why did you go away when Mommy died? Vivian's eyes filled with tears. I was sad too, sweetheart. Sometimes when grown-ups are very sad, they make mistakes. Did you come back to make more mistakes? Sophie asked. Because Miss Grace helps me not make mistakes when I'm sad, and she helps Daddy too, and I don't want you to make her go away. The simple honesty of a 6-year-old cut through all the adult posturing and legal threats. For a moment, Vivian looked lost, uncertain. Sophie, she said finally, what if I told you that you could come live with me? In a big house with a garden and your own pony? Sophie considered this seriously. Would Daddy come too? Well, no. It would just be you and me. What about Miss Grace? Sophie, Miss Grace is just your teacher. She's not really part of your family. Sophie looked up at Grace, then at her father, then back at her grandmother. When she spoke, her voice was clear and certain. Yes, she is, Sophie said. She's the part of my family that helps me remember it's okay to miss Mommy and still be happy sometimes. And if you want to be my family too, you have to be nice to her. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what had just happened. Sophie hadn't just defended her. She'd claimed her, publicly, completely, and without reservation. I think, Principal Williams said diplomatically, we should all take some time to process this situation. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps you'd like to schedule a proper visit with Sophie? One that doesn't involve accusations or legal threats? Vivian looked around the room, at Ethan's protective stance, at Grace's quiet dignity, at Sophie's unwavering certainty. Finally, her shoulders sagged. I miss my daughter so much," she whispered. "And Sophie is all I have left of her." "Then maybe," Sophie said, walking over to take her grandmother's hand, "you could miss Mommy with us. Miss Grace says missing people together makes it hurt less." And in that moment, Grace saw the first crack in Vivian's armor, the first possibility that this story might have a different ending than anyone had expected. Because sometimes the people who threaten to tear your family apart are actually just broken pieces of the same story, waiting to be put back together. 3 days after the confrontation at school, Grace found herself doing something she never thought she'd do, sitting across from Vivian Ashford in an upscale cafe in downtown Seattle, watching Sophie's grandmother nervously stir sugar into her third cup of coffee. The meeting had been Sophie's idea, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that only 6-year-olds possessed. "If Grandma Vivian wants to be part of our family, she has to learn how to be nice to everyone. Maybe you could teach her, Miss Grace." "I owe you an apology," Vivian said finally, not meeting Grace's eyes. "What I said at the school, it was inexcusable." "You were hurting," Grace replied quietly. "Grief makes people say things they don't mean. But I did mean it. In that moment, I absolutely meant every word." Vivian looked up, her green eyes, so much like Sophie's, filled with something that looked like shame. "I've spent 3 years convincing myself that Ethan stole my daughter away from me, that if she'd never married him, never moved to Seattle, she'd still be alive." Grace set down her teacup carefully. "But you know that's not true." "Logically, yes. Emotionally?" Vivian's laugh was bitter. "I've been drowning in blame for so long I forgot how to swim." "What changed your mind about meeting with me?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the cafe's windows. "Sophie called me." Grace's eyebrows rose. "She called you?" "Ethan gave her my number and told her she could reach out if she wanted to." "I never expected." Vivian's voice caught. "She called to invite me to something called Memory Day at school." "Do you know what that is?" Grace's chest tightened. Memory Day was a project she'd been working on with Sophie, a presentation about someone special in her life. Sophie had been planning to talk about her mother. "It's next Friday," Grace said. "Sophie's been working on a presentation about Isabella. She wants me to come. She said she's going to tell everyone about her mommy, and she wants her mommy's mommy to be there too." Tears spilled over Vivian's carefully applied mascara. "She doesn't even remember me, but she wants me there." "Sophie has a very big heart," Grace said gently. "She gets that from both sides of her family. I looked you up, you know, after the school incident." Vivian wiped her eyes with a cloth napkin. "Your credentials, your background, your published research on childhood grief. You're not some opportunistic gold digger. You're exactly the kind of person Isabella would have wanted for Sophie." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Grace felt her throat tighten. "Thank you for saying that. I also looked up the Morrison woman, the one trying to get Sophie transferred." Vivian's expression hardened. "Trust fund baby who's never worked a day in her life, married to a man 20 years older, trying to control everyone around her because she has no real purpose. She's exactly the kind of person Isabella couldn't stand." Despite everything, Grace felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Are you offering to help us fight her?" "I'm offering to destroy her," Vivian said matter-of-factly. "I may be a grieving mother, but I'm also a very successful attorney with significant influence in this city. Candace Morrison picked the wrong fight." Grace stared at her, processing this unexpected turn. "Why would you do that? You hardly know us." "Because Sophie chose you, and my granddaughter has excellent judgment. She gets that from her mother, too." Vivian leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "But I need to know something first. Are you in this for the long haul? Because if you're going to break that little girl's heart, or her father's, I will make your life very difficult." "I'm in this forever," Grace said without hesitation. "I love them both. I love Sophie's courage and her kindness and the way she sees the world. I love Ethan's dedication and his vulnerability and the way he puts her first in everything. I love the family we're building together, even if it means dealing with a difficult grandmother who's been terrible to all of you." Grace met Vivian's eyes steadily, especially then, because Sophie deserves to know all the people who loved her mother, and because I think Isabella would want her daughter to have a relationship with her grandmother. Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with 3 years of suppressed grief. "I miss her so much," she whispered. "I miss my baby girl so much I can barely breathe sometimes." Grace reached across the table and covered Vivian's hand with her own. Tell me about her. Tell me about Isabella. For the next hour, Vivian shared stories Grace had never heard. Isabella's terrible singing voice that she insisted was just misunderstood. Her obsession with romance novels that made her cry happy tears. The way she used to call her mother every Sunday morning to discuss whatever cooking disaster she'd attempted that week. She was a hopeless cook, Vivian said, laughing through her tears. But she kept trying because she wanted to make Ethan those elaborate meals she saw on cooking shows. He'd eat every burned, over-salted disaster and tell her it was delicious. He still can't cook, Grace said softly. Most nights, it's takeout or frozen dinners. Isabella would hate that. She'd want Sophie eating real food even if it was badly prepared real food. Maybe you could teach her some of Isabella's recipes, the ones that didn't involve potential fire hazards. Vivian looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. You'd want that? You'd let me be part of Sophie's life that way? I'd love that. Sophie should know where she comes from, should have connections to her mother's family. And honestly, Grace smiled. I could use some help in the kitchen department too. You can't cook either? I can make grilled cheese and heat up soup. That's about the extent of my culinary skills. Oh, good Lord, Vivian said, but she was smiling now. No wonder Sophie is so skinny. Between you and Ethan, that child is going to waste away. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easier than either of them had expected. When they finally prepared to leave, Vivian hesitated. Grace, there's something else. About the custody threat, she looked genuinely ashamed. I never actually filed anything. I was bluffing, trying to scare Ethan into, I don't know what I was trying to accomplish. Hurting him the way I was hurting, I suppose. Does he know that? Not yet. I need to tell him myself. I need to apologize to both of you properly. Vivian gathered her purse and coat. I also need to call off my private investigator and deal with the Morrison situation. Vivian, Grace said as they reached the cafe door, Memory Day is at 2 p.m. next Friday. Sophie would really love to have you there. I'll be there, Vivian promised. And Grace, thank you for giving an old woman a second chance to get this right. That evening, Grace sat in Ethan's living room, watching him help Sophie practice her Memory Day presentation. They'd set up poster boards on the coffee table, covered with photos of Isabella that Ethan had finally felt ready to display. And this is when Mommy and Daddy got married, Sophie was saying, pointing to a picture of a laughing bride and groom. Daddy says Mommy was so happy she snorted like a pig. I did not say pig, Ethan protested, grinning. I said she made a very cute snorting sound. Same thing, Sophie said matter-of-factly. And this is Mommy holding me when I was a tiny baby. She looks really tired but really happy. Grace watched them together, her heart full. This was what healing looked like. Not forgetting the past but integrating it into a new future. Sophie, she said gently, I had coffee with Grandma Vivian today. Both Sophie and Ethan looked up with interest. She's very excited about Memory Day, Grace continued, and she has lots of stories about your mommy that you've never heard. Good stories? Sophie asked. Wonderful stories. About how your mommy used to burn dinner and sing off-key and read romance novels that made her cry. Sophie giggled. Mommy cried at books? Happy tears, Grace explained. The kind you get when something is so beautiful it makes your heart too full. Ethan was watching Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. After Sophie went to bed, he pulled her aside. What really happened at coffee with Vivian, he asked. Grace told him everything. The apology, the custody bluff, the offer to help with Candace Morrison, the stories about Isabella. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a long moment. She's really trying to make amends, he said finally. She is. She misses Isabella, and she wants to be part of Sophie's life, but only if we're comfortable with it. And are you? Comfortable with it? Grace considered the question seriously. I think Sophie deserves to have as many people love her as possible, and I think your wife would want her daughter to know her grandmother. Ethan pulled Grace into his arms, holding her close. How did I get so lucky? He murmured against her hair. How did I find someone who loves my daughter enough to make peace with her worst enemy? She's not our enemy anymore, Grace said softly. She's just another person who loves Sophie, and there's room in our family for that. As they stood there together, Grace felt something settle into place. The pieces of their complicated family puzzle were finally starting to fit together. But the real test was still to come, because sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or school offices, but in the hearts of 6-year-olds who just want everyone they love to be happy. The morning of Memory Day dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Riverside Elementary. as families began arriving for the special presentations. Grace stood in her classroom adjusting the microphone for the third time and trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. This wasn't just any school event. Today, Sophie would stand in front of parents, teachers, and classmates to talk about her mother for the first time in 3 years. Today, everything they'd worked toward would be put to the test. "Miss Grace?" Sophie appeared in the doorway, wearing a navy blue dress with yellow flowers, the same yellow as the roses they'd brought to the cemetery. In her hands, she clutched a small wooden frame. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Grace said, crouching down to Sophie's level. "Are you ready?" "I think so. I have all my pictures, and I practiced my words last night with Daddy." Sophie held up the frame, revealing a photo Grace had never seen before. Isabella holding a newborn Sophie, both of them looking exhausted but radiantly happy. "This is my favorite one. Daddy gave it to me this morning." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "It's perfect. Miss Grace, will you sit in the front row, right next to Daddy and Grandma Vivian? If that's where you want me, that's where I'll be." Families began filing into the classroom 20 minutes before the presentations were scheduled to start. Grace watched Ethan enter with Vivian at his side, both of them looking nervous but united. It was the first time they'd been in the same room since the confrontation in the principal's office, but Sophie had insisted they both needed to be there. Then Candace Morrison walked in with her daughter Tiana, her expression sharp and predatory as she scanned the room. She'd been unusually quiet since Vivian's conversation with her earlier in the week, a conversation that Grace suspected had involved some very specific legal language about harassment and defamation. "Welcome, everyone," Grace said, stepping to the front of the classroom as the last few parents found seats. "Today is a very special day for our students. They've been working hard to prepare presentations about someone important in their lives, someone who has shaped who they are and who they want to become." She made eye contact with Sophie, who was sitting in the front row between her father and grandmother, the wooden frame balanced carefully on her lap. "Our first presenter is Dylan, who's going to tell us about his grandfather who taught him to fish." One by one, the children presented their memory projects. Dylan talked about fishing trips and life lessons. Aisha shared stories about her aunt who was a doctor in Somalia. Marcus presented a photo timeline of his dad's military service. With each presentation, Grace could see Sophie growing more nervous, her small hands gripping the picture frame tighter. Finally, it was her turn. "Our last presenter today is Sophie," Grace said gently. "Sophie, would you like to come up?" Sophie stood on shaky legs, walking to the front of the classroom with her poster board and photo. For a moment, she just stood there, looking out at all the faces watching her. Grace could see the exact moment when the magnitude of what she was about to do hit her. She was going to talk about her mother in front of everyone, including the girl who'd told her she should be over it by now. "I can't," Sophie whispered, so quietly only Grace could hear. Without hesitation, Grace moved to stand beside her. "What do you need, sweetheart? I'm scared they'll think I'm weird for still missing her." Grace knelt down so they were at eye level, speaking quietly enough that only Sophie could hear. "Do you remember what I told you about courage? That it's not about not being scared. It's about doing important things even when you are scared. Is telling everyone about your mommy important?" Sophie looked out at the audience, her gaze finding her father and grandmother in the front row. Both of them were watching her with such love and encouragement that it seemed to give her strength. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's very important. Then you have everything you need." Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath. When she spoke, her voice carried across the classroom clearly. "Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie Mercer, and I want to tell you about my mommy, Isabella." Grace stepped back, giving Sophie the spotlight but staying close enough to offer support if needed. "My mommy died in a car accident when I was 3 years old," Sophie continued, holding up the photo of her and Isabella. "For a really long time I was too sad to talk about her because I thought it would make me cry. But Miss Grace taught me that crying about people we love is okay, because it means we have big hearts." Grace glanced at the audience and saw several parents wiping their eyes. Even Candace Morrison looked uncomfortable, though whether from guilt or annoyance was hard to tell. "My mommy was really pretty, and she had a laugh that sounded like music. She couldn't cook very good. Daddy says she burned everything, but she tried really hard anyway because she wanted to take care of us." Sophie pointed to different photos on her poster board as she spoke. "This is Mommy and Daddy on their wedding day. She was so happy she made a funny snorting sound and everyone laughed, but not mean laughing. Happy laughing." She picked up another photo. "And this is Mommy reading me a story when I was little. Daddy says she read to me every single night, even when she was tired from work. My mommy loved yellow flowers and books that made her cry happy tears. She used to sing to me, but Grandma Vivian says she wasn't very good at singing. She sang anyway because she said the most important thing about a lullaby isn't how pretty it sounds, but how much love is in it. Grace saw Vivian press a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I miss my mommy every day, Sophie said, her voice wavering slightly. But I'm not sad about missing her anymore because Miss Grace helped me understand that missing someone means you love them very much. And love doesn't stop just because someone goes to heaven. She paused, looking directly at Tiana Morrison for the first time. Some people think 3 years is a long time to miss someone, but I think some people are worth missing forever. The classroom was completely silent except for the sound of muffled crying from several parents. My mommy can't hug me anymore, but I can still feel her love every day. When Daddy makes me pancakes the way she used to. When Grandma Vivian tells me stories about when Mommy was little. When Miss Grace helped me be brave enough to talk about missing her. Sophie looked at Grace then, and the love in her eyes was so pure and trusting that Grace felt her heart might burst. Miss Grace says that the people we love become part of who we are. So even though my mommy is in heaven, she's still here too. Sophie pressed her hand to her heart. She's in here, and in Daddy, and in Grandma Vivian. And she's in Miss Grace too, because Miss Grace loves me the way Mommy would want someone to love me. Grace couldn't hold back her tears anymore. This brave little girl, who'd been so scared and closed off just months ago, was standing in front of a room full of people sharing her deepest feelings with complete honesty. The end, Sophie said simply, then looked at Grace. Did I do okay? The applause that erupted was immediate and thunderous. Parents were crying openly. Children were clapping enthusiastically, and even some of the teachers who'd slipped in to listen were wiping their eyes. Grace swept Sophie into a hug, lifting her off the ground. You were perfect, she whispered. Absolutely perfect. As the applause died down and families began to mingle, Grace noticed Candace Morrison approaching them. Her expression was unreadable, and Grace tensed, preparing to protect Sophie from any cruel comments. But when Candace spoke, her voice was quiet and somewhat shaky. Sophie, she said, that was very brave of you. I'm sorry if Tiana said anything that hurt your feelings. Sophie studied the woman seriously. It's okay. Sometimes people say mean things when they don't understand. Miss Grace says understanding takes practice. Your Miss Grace sounds very wise, Candace said, glancing at Grace with something that might have been respect. And your mommy sounds like she was a wonderful person. She was, Sophie said confidently. Do you want to see more pictures of her? As Sophie began showing Candace her photo collection, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Ethan behind her, his eyes red but his smile radiant. I don't have words, he said quietly. What you've done for her, for us, I'll never be able to thank you enough. You don't need to thank me, Grace replied. She did all the hard work. I just gave her permission to feel. No, Ethan said, pulling her closer. You gave her permission to heal, and you gave me permission to love again. Before Grace could respond, Vivian appeared beside them, tears still streaming down her face. Isabella would be so proud, she said, watching Sophie animatedly describing her poster to a group of children who'd gathered around her. She'd be proud of Sophie's courage, and she'd be grateful that you two found each other. Do you really think so? Grace asked. I know so, Vivian said firmly, because I see the way Sophie looks at you. It's the same way she used to look at her mother, with complete trust and absolute love, and I see the way you look at her, like she's the most precious thing in the world. That's what Isabella would have wanted for her daughter. As the afternoon wound down and families began to leave, Grace found herself alone in the classroom with the 3 people who'd become her whole world. Sophie was carefully packing away her photos, chattering happily about how well her presentation had gone. Ethan was helping clean up the refreshment table. Vivian was studying the memory wall Grace had created, reading the other children's projects with genuine interest. It was a moment of perfect domesticity, of family in all its complicated, beautiful forms. Miss Grace, Sophie looked up from her photo collection. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. When I said that Mommy is part of you because you love me, is that really true? Grace knelt down beside Sophie, choosing her words carefully. I think when we love someone, we carry a little piece of everyone they've ever loved. So yes, I think I do carry a piece of your mommy's love because I love you and your daddy so much. Sophie considered this seriously, then nodded. Good, because I want you to keep that piece forever. Forever is exactly how long I plan to keep it, Grace promised. And as Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them, as Vivian smiled through her tears, as the late afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, Grace knew that they'd all found their way home. Because sometimes the most powerful words come from the smallest voices, and sometimes healing happens when we finally have the courage to speak our love out loud. 6 months later, Grace stood in the kitchen of Ethan's penthouse, flour in her hair and what she hoped was cookie dough on her apron, watching Sophie and Vivian frost cupcakes with the focused intensity of master artists. "No, Grandma, the swirl has to go the other way," Sophie instructed, demonstrating with her own perfectly imperfect creation. "Mommy always made them with happy swirls, not sad ones." "Happy swirls it is," Vivian said solemnly, adjusting her technique. "Though I'm not entirely sure what makes a swirl happy versus sad." "The direction," Sophie explained with 6-year-old certainty. "Happy goes up, sad goes down. Everybody knows that." Grace smiled, marveling at how normal this had become. Sunday afternoons filled with laughter and minor kitchen disasters. Sophie's easy chatter weaving together stories of her mother with plans for tomorrow. The healing that had seemed impossible just months ago now felt as natural as breathing. "How are the cookies coming along, Chef Grace?" Ethan asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pressing a kiss to her temple. "I think I've discovered a new way to burn sugar," Grace said, leaning back against his chest. "Your daughter's faith in my baking abilities is wildly misplaced." "Our daughter," Ethan corrected quietly, the words carrying weight they'd both been dancing around for weeks. Grace turned in his arms, studying his face. "Our daughter? If you want her to be. If you want us to be." Before Grace could respond, Sophie's voice piped up from across the kitchen. "Are you guys talking about the surprise?" Grace and Ethan froze. "What surprise?" Grace asked. Sophie exchanged a look with Vivian that was far too conspiratorial for a 6-year-old. "The surprise we've been planning." "Duh. Sophie Elizabeth Mercer," Ethan said in his most serious parental voice. "What have you been planning?" "Nothing bad," Sophie said quickly. Well, Grandma Vivian and I think you're taking too long to figure out the obvious thing." "What obvious thing?" Grace asked, though her heart was already starting to race. "That you should get married so we can be a real family," Sophie said matter-of-factly, as if this was the most logical conclusion in the world. "I already asked Mommy about it when we visited her last week, and I think she said yes." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "You asked your mother?" "Well, I talked to her gravestone, but I felt like she was listening. And when the wind blew and made the yellow flowers dance, I figured that was her way of saying she liked the idea." Ethan was staring at his daughter in amazement. "Sophie, honey, marriage is a very big decision. Miss Grace and I need to—" "Need to what?" Vivian interrupted, setting down her cupcake with a decisive motion. "Need to overthink something that's been obvious to everyone else for months?" "Grandma Vivian is right," Sophie added. "You love each other and you love me and I love both of you. Plus, Miss Grace makes you smile the way you used to smile in pictures with Mommy. Not the same way, but happy." Grace found herself speechless, overwhelmed by the simple truth in Sophie's words. This child who'd been so afraid of love and loss just months ago was now orchestrating their future with the confidence of someone who finally understood that love multiplies rather than divides. "There's more to the surprise," Sophie continued, clearly enjoying having the adults' full attention. "Grandma Vivian helped me pick out a ring." "You picked out a ring?" Grace managed to say. "Well, technically, I picked out the ring," Vivian said, producing a small velvet box from her purse. "But Sophie chose the style. She insisted it had to have yellow stones like her mother's favorite flowers." Ethan took the box with shaking hands, opening it to reveal a delicate band set with a diamond surrounded by tiny yellow sapphires. It was beautiful, unique, and absolutely perfect. Ethan's voice broke. "This is not how I planned to do this." "How did you plan to do it?" Sophie asked with genuine curiosity. "I was going to wait until the perfect moment. Take Grace somewhere romantic. Have a whole speech prepared about how much I love her and how I can't imagine my life without her." "This is perfect," Grace said softly, tears streaming down her face. "This is absolutely perfect." "Really?" Ethan asked, studying her face. "Because it's completely chaotic and our 6-year-old daughter essentially just proposed for me?" "Really?" Grace laughed through her tears. "Because it's completely us. Unconventional and beautiful, and led by the wisest person in this room." Sophie beamed at being called wise, then looked expectantly at Ethan. "Well, are you going to ask her properly?" Ethan looked around the kitchen, at the flour-covered counters, at Vivian trying not to cry into the cupcake frosting, at Sophie covered head to toe in baking ingredients, at Grace in her ridiculous apron with her hair in disarray, and his face broke into the most radiant smile Grace had ever seen. "You're right," he said, getting down on one knee right there between the mixing bowls and cookie sheets. "This is perfect." Grace's heart stopped as he took her flour-covered hand in his. "Grace Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "6 months ago you walked into our lives and changed everything. You taught my daughter that it's okay to grieve, okay to remember, okay to love again. You taught me that moving forward doesn't mean leaving the past behind. You taught both of us that families can grow and change and become something even more beautiful than what came before." "Daddy, you're making me cry," Sophie whispered loudly. "You're making all of us cry, sweetheart," Vivian added, not bothering to hide her tears. "Grace," Ethan continued, "you love my daughter like she's your own. You honor the memory of the woman who came before you. You've made our house feel like a home again. Will you marry me? Will you be Sophie's stepmom and my wife and the person we get to love for the rest of our lives?" Grace looked down at this man who'd been brave enough to love again, at the little girl who'd orchestrated this entire moment, at the grandmother who'd found her way back to family. Her heart was so full she thought it might burst. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." The kitchen erupted in cheers as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. Sophie launched herself at both of them, wrapping them in a fierce hug that smelled like vanilla and sugar and pure joy. "Now we're really a family," Sophie declared with satisfaction. "And Mommy gets to have 2 people who love me instead of just 1. 3 people, Vivian corrected, joining their group hug. "Don't forget about Grandma. 4 people, Grace said softly. "Because your mommy will always love you too, sweetheart. Always." That evening, after the cupcakes were eaten and the kitchen was cleaned and Vivian had gone home with promises to help plan the wedding, Grace sat on Sophie's bed reading the goodnight story that had become their ritual. "Miss Grace," Sophie said as Grace closed the book, "can I still call you Miss Grace after you marry Daddy?" Grace smiled. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, sweetheart. Miss Grace, Grace, Mom, whatever makes you happy." Sophie considered this seriously. I think I'd like to call you Mom Grace because you're going to be my mom, but Miss Grace was the person who helped me not be scared anymore. I want to remember both." "Mom Grace," Grace repeated, testing the words. "I love that. Good. And Mom Grace?" "Yes? I'm really happy you said yes to marrying Daddy, but I'm even more happy that you said yes to being my mom." Grace leaned down and kissed Sophie's forehead, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and the lingering sweetness of cupcake frosting. "I'm happy about that too," she whispered. "The happiest I've ever been." Later, as Grace and Ethan sat on the couch looking through wedding magazines that Vivian had somehow already delivered, Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The broken little girl who'd been afraid to love. The grieving father who'd thought his heart was permanently closed. The teacher who'd been carrying her own scars while helping others heal. "Regrets?" Ethan asked, as if reading her thoughts. "About what?" "About getting engaged in a kitchen covered in flour. Proposed to by our 6-year-old with my former enemy as our witness." Grace laughed, settling closer to him on the couch. "Are you kidding? This is the most perfect engagement story ever. It's chaotic and unconventional and led by the person who loves us both most in the world." "She does love us, doesn't she?" Ethan said wonderingly. "Sometimes I look at her and can't believe how brave she's become." "She learned it from you," Grace said. "The courage to love even when it's scary. The willingness to fight for the people who matter." "No," Ethan said, pulling her closer. "She learned it from all of us. From you teaching her that grief doesn't have to be shameful. From Vivian showing her that people can change and grow. From her mother's memory giving her a foundation of love to build on. And from you," Grace added, "showing her every day that she's worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, planning a future that felt both inevitable and miraculous, a future that honored the past while embracing the possibility of new love, new traditions, new ways of being a family. "Grace," Ethan said eventually. Thank you." "For what?" "For saving us, for seeing what we could become and helping us get there." Grace turned to look at him, this man who'd learned to love again despite his fear, who'd trusted her with his most precious treasure. "You saved me too," she said quietly. "Both of you. You taught me that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself. It means becoming more yourself than you ever thought possible. Outside, Seattle sparkled in the evening light, full of promise and possibility. Inside, their small family was planning a wedding, a future, a lifetime of Sunday afternoon baking disasters and bedtime stories, and the kind of love that makes everything else worthwhile. And in a frame on Sophie's nightstand, Isabella's photo seemed to smile down on all of them, blessing the love that had grown from loss, the family that had been built on the foundation of her own enduring love. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone new. They're about finding the courage to love again, deeper and truer than ever before. 5 years later, the yellow roses were Sophie's idea, just like they always were. Grace stood at the kitchen window of their new house, watching her 11-year-old daughter carefully arrange fresh flowers in the vase that had become their Sunday tradition. Outside, the backyard was alive with the chaos of a family barbecue. Ethan manning the grill with the serious concentration of a man who'd finally learned to cook something other than takeout. Vivian chasing 3-year-old Isabella around the garden while she squealed with delight, and their newest addition, baby Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his carrier despite the joyful noise surrounding him. "Mom, Grace, do you think these look okay?" Sophie asked, holding up the vase with the critical eye of someone who'd inherited both her mother's perfectionism and her grandmother's artistic sensibilities. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Grace said, marveling at the young woman Sophie was becoming, confident, compassionate, with Isabella's eyes and Ethan's determined chin, but a strength that was entirely her own. "Good, because I want everything to be perfect for when we visit Mommy Isabella today." Sophie paused, still sometimes needing to clarify which mother she was talking about. "I want to tell her about Thomas sleeping through the night, and about my science fair project, and about how Daddy finally learned to make pancakes without burning them. 5 years of marriage, 3 children, and a house in the suburbs that somehow held all their dreams. It wasn't the life Grace had imagined for herself. It was better. "Sophie, can you help me get your brother ready?" Grace called, lifting Thomas from his carrier. At 6 months old, he was a perfect blend of his parents. Grace's auburn hair, Ethan's green eyes, and a temperament so easy it made them wonder if they'd used up all their parenting challenges with his sisters. "Is Bella coming with us to the cemetery?" Sophie asked, expertly buckling Thomas into his car seat with the competence of a big sister who'd helped raise 2 younger siblings. "Of course. She always wants to bring Mommy Isabella flowers, too." It had been Grace's idea to give their second daughter Isabella's name. She'd suggested it quietly one night when they'd learned they were having a girl, watching Ethan's face carefully for any sign that it might be too painful. Instead, he'd cried happy tears and said it was perfect, a way to honor the past while celebrating the future. Little Isabella Rose Mercer had arrived 3 years ago with her mother's fierce determination and her father's stubborn streak, keeping the entire family on their toes with her boundless energy and complete fearlessness. She adored her big sister, tolerated her baby brother, and had wrapped both her grandmothers around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. "Daddy," Bella's voice carried across the backyard. "Grandma Vivian says you're burning the hamburgers again." "I am not burning them," Ethan called back. "They're getting perfectly charred." "That's the same thing," Bella replied with the logic of a 3-year-old who'd already learned to hold her own in family debates. Grace smiled, remembering the early days when Ethan had been so careful around Sophie, so afraid of saying the wrong thing or making the wrong choice. Now he parented with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned that love was more important than perfection. "All right, troops," Grace called out the back door. "Cemetery visit in 10 minutes, then we're coming back for Grandma Vivian's famous potato salad. And Grandpa Robert's terrible jokes," Sophie added with a grin. Vivian had surprised everyone by remarrying 2 years ago, a quiet ceremony to a retired judge named Robert, who was patient with her strong opinions and delighted by her granddaughter's dramatics. He'd fit into their extended family like he'd always belonged there, bringing terrible puns and endless patience for tea parties. The drive to Greenwood Cemetery had become a monthly ritual, sometimes just Grace and Ethan and the kids, sometimes with Vivian and Robert too. Today, it was just their immediate family, the car filled with the comfortable chaos of children and diaper bags, and Sophie's carefully researched stories about her school projects. They found Isabella's grave exactly as they'd left it the month before, except for the small solar lights that Vivian had added to mark the path. The headstone had been updated years ago to include not just beloved wife and mother, but forever part of our growing family. "Hi, Mommy Isabella," Bella announced cheerfully, plopping down on the grass with the casual familiarity of a child who'd been visiting this place her entire life. I brought you drawings. Sophie knelt more carefully, arranging the yellow roses with the reverence that came from being old enough to understand the significance of this place. I have lots to tell you, she said softly. Grace and Ethan hung back slightly, giving the children space for their private conversations while keeping Thomas happy in his stroller. This had become their tradition too, watching their daughters talk to the woman who'd started it all, the love that had made everything else possible. She's getting so grown up, Ethan said quietly, watching Sophie show Isabella's headstone her science fair ribbon. She is, but she still needs this. They all do. Even Thomas? Grace looked down at their son who was contentedly chewing on his fingers and watching the trees sway overhead. Especially Thomas. He should know where he comes from, know that love doesn't end, and families can be complicated and beautiful, and that his mom Grace was brave enough to love a broken family and help put them back together. Grace leaned against Ethan's shoulder, marveling at how solid and warm he felt after all these years. I think he should know that sometimes broken things, when they're put back together, are stronger than they were before. Daddy, come here, Bella called imperiously. Mommy Isabella needs to hear about Thomas's first tooth. They spent the next 20 minutes in comfortable conversation with a headstone, their children chattering about school and friends and the new kitten Grandma Vivian had gotten against all reasonable advice. It should have been sad, this family tradition, but instead it felt like completion, like honoring the foundation that had made everything else possible. We should head back, Grace said eventually, as Thomas started to fuss and Bella began to get restless. Grandma Vivian will have our heads if we're late for her potato salad. As they gathered up the children and prepared to leave, Sophie lingered by the headstone for a moment longer. Thank you, Mommy Isabella, she said quietly, for Daddy, and for Mom Grace, and for helping us all find each other. The drive home was filled with the comfortable noise of a family, Thomas babbling contentedly, Bella singing an off-key version of her favorite song, Sophie reading aloud from the book she'd brought for the car ride. Grace found herself thinking about the long journey from that first day at Riverside Elementary to this moment, sitting in traffic with her husband and 3 children, planning the rest of a Sunday that would be filled with family and laughter and the kind of ordinary magic that made life worth living. Regrets? Ethan asked, echoing the question he'd asked on their engagement night. Grace looked back at their children, Sophie growing into a young woman who carried her mother's memory with grace and pride, Bella, who approached the world with fearless joy, Thomas, who would grow up knowing he was wanted and loved and part of something bigger than himself. Just one, she said. Ethan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Oh, I regret that Isabella never got to meet them, Grace said, gesturing toward the back seat. I think she would have loved watching Sophie become who she's becoming. I think she would have laughed at Bella's dramatic tendencies. I think she would have spoiled Thomas rotten. She did get to meet them, Sophie said from the back seat, apparently listening to their conversation despite her book. Maybe not in person, but she's part of all of us. Every time Daddy makes us pancakes, every time you help me be brave, every time Bella laughs really loud, that's Mommy Isabella too. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, Sophie could still surprise her with the depth of her wisdom. You're right, sweetheart, she said. She did get to meet them. She gets to meet them every day. Back at the house, the afternoon unfolded exactly as Grace had imagined. Vivian's potato salad was, as always, perfect. Robert's jokes were, as promised, terrible, but delivered with such enthusiasm that everyone laughed anyway. Bella convinced her grandfather to push her on the swing set Ethan had built in the backyard. Sophie helped serve dessert with the responsibility of someone who took her role as eldest seriously. Thomas slept peacefully through most of it, waking only to charm his extended family with gummy smiles and happy babbling. As the sun began to set and their guests prepared to leave, Grace found herself standing in the doorway of their house, watching Ethan help buckle car seats and say goodbye to Vivian and Robert. This house, which they'd bought when Grace was pregnant with Bella, had become exactly what they'd hoped. A place where love lived in every room, where children could grow and explore and be safe, where the past was honored and the future was bright with possibility. Mom, Grace? Sophie appeared beside her, having finished cleaning up the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that being part of a family meant everyone pitched in. What is it, sweetheart? Do you think Mommy Isabella would be proud of who we became? Grace looked out at their life, at Ethan making sure everyone got home safely, at Bella showing off her playground skills to anyone who would watch, at Thomas gurgling happily in his grandfather's arms, at the family they'd built from grief and hope and the simple decision to love each other fiercely. "I think," Grace said, pulling Sophie close, "she would be amazed by the beautiful, brave, compassionate young woman you've become. I think she would love seeing your daddy happy again. I think she would be grateful that you have so many people who love you. And what about you? Do you think she'd be proud of you?" Grace considered the question seriously. 5 years ago, she'd been a teacher helping a broken family heal. Now she was a mother, a wife, a daughter-in-law, a woman who'd learned that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about building something new and beautiful on the foundation of what came before. "I think," she said finally, "she would be proud that I loved you and your daddy enough to help you remember her. And I think she'd be happy that our family has room for everyone, the people who are here and the people who live in our hearts." "Good," Sophie said with satisfaction, "because I think we turned out pretty great." "Yeah," Grace agreed, watching Ethan walk back toward the house with a sleeping Thomas in his arms, Bella skipping beside him, their whole beautiful, chaotic, perfectly imperfect family coming home. "I think we did too." That night, after the children were all asleep and the house was quiet, Grace and Ethan sat on their back porch swing, sharing a cup of coffee and watching the stars appear over Seattle. The city sparkled in the distance, full of other families, other love stories, other people learning that healing was possible and love could multiply instead of divide. "Happy?" Ethan asked, the question he'd started asking every Sunday night, a tradition that had begun in the early days of their marriage and continued through sleepless nights with babies and busy days with growing children. "Completely," Grace answered, as she always did, settling against his shoulder as the swing moved gently back and forth. And in the quiet of their backyard, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Grace knew that sometimes the most beautiful stories weren't about finding perfect love the first time. Sometimes they were about finding the courage to love again, to build something new without forgetting what came before, to trust that broken hearts could heal stronger than they'd ever been. Sometimes they were about a teacher who saved a family, and a family who saved her right back. Sometimes they were about yellow roses and memory days and the understanding that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form, becoming part of everything that grows in its wake. What did you learn from this story? Would you have the courage to love someone this way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.